Okay, two milestones in the saga. That is the Russian-Ukrainian war, both with Donald Trump at the center of the swirl. On Friday, the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, and yesterday, on Monday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy came to the White House, flanked by 7 European leaders. And as much as the words and discussion are important, so too are the images, gestures, and protocols seen, watched, and beamed across the globe. In a world of never-ending media coverage, the picture is not only worth 1,000 words, but it broadcasts policies, positions, insights, and strength. From the red carpet to a black suit. What can we learn about the peace process simply from the images we're seeing? Joining us to discuss this and more surrounding the search for a resolution is Ronan O'Malley, Chief Program Officer at the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Welcome to the program, Ronan.
Ernie and all of you, it's great to be back, and congratulations on the new show and the new studio. All looks wonderful.
Before you say anything, I want to let people know if you want to join the conversation and chat with us, give us a call or text 713-440-8870. Ronan, take it away.
Sure. Maybe before getting to maybe two notable symbols from the last few days, I would mention what's maybe getting the most play back in Russia, where most or all, I should say, of the media is state-controlled, or at least influenced and dominated, is the fact that this happened at all in the United States. So this is the first time an American president has hosted Putin since 2007, when Putin invaded Georgia in 2008, and he still holds territory in Georgia. Obviously, it was near the end of his term. George Bush would not host him again after that. There are big sanctions. 2014, Putin annexes takes over Crimea, foments a civil war in the east of Ukraine. During Obama's time, and even during Trump's first term, he was never hosted in the United States. So this
Well, let me ask you this:
Sure.
was there anything to it being in Alaska as opposed to Washington?
That, I think, is probably some of it. He didn't want to give it the degree of formality of a full, state, affair being hosted in the White House, and the same way you would fet, say, the European leaders that have come, this week. Mm-hmm. But I think some of it, Trump himself liked to play up, and Putin as well, this idea of this was once Russian territory. There's still Russian churches in some of the small villages of Alaska. It's kind of halfway between the two capitals.
Yeah, it felt like two old men who didn't want to travel that far. Like, I'll meet you in Alaska,
Well, when you talk about the image of Putin on U.S. soil, shaking hands with the U.S. president, globally, what does that image say?
I think in a lot of ways it's just what Putin wanted. It's the same way, if you remember the first term for Kim, the head of the third leader of this generational rule in North Korea. Just to have a summit with the American president, the most powerful person in the world, is a coup. That's a sign that you're being granted that prestige, that access. You're on the same stage with them. So I think from Putin's perspective, it was a big coup. The other thing was a bit unique was typically, if a host country hosts something like this at that diplomatic level, the host president or the host prime minister will give the first remarks afterwards and talk first. You might have noticed that was flipped, that Putin gave the first remarks. It wasn't definitively made clear why that happened. The other thing was there had been said in advance that both Putin and Trump would give remarks and talk to the media and have a kind of a brief press conference afterwards, which in essence didn't really happen. And I think, maybe if you want to look at symbols from Alaska, maybe one of the most important symbols I find was not what was happening there on the red carpet or what you saw in their kind of, highlight moments on TV. It's Sergei Lavrov, who's the foreign minister for 21 years now, extremely smart, obviously very seasoned, capable diplomat. This was absolutely not a mistake. But when he arrives at the summit, he's seen walking into the buildings of the hotel wearing a sweatshirt underneath that says CCP. This is the USSR Union. Basically.
Yeah.
And in some ways, obviously that's trolling the Ukrainians, that's trolling Zelenskyy, perhaps somewhat trolling Trump, because this is all about Putin's idea of reconstituting the greater Russia, Nova Russia.
I want to go back to that sweatshirt in a minute, but one more thing. Both the White House and the Kremlin sent out photos of behind-the-scenes moments. One had Putin looking very much in charge of Trump, one with Trump the finger into Putin looking like they're in charge. How they're playing these to give the image they want. But how do you find out in today's day and age where the reality lies in what the true conversation, what the true interaction was?
I think that's a lot of people are saying that's what's the difficulty, especially about what happened. It was a very brief 3 hours together, a limited number of people in the room. Remarks weren't really given about what was or was not discussed. As far as what we know, it's good that they spoke with each other, but in terms of there was no points made, Putin will finally give up on this point or that point, and we can move from there. But basically, I think the difficulty is, in a lot of ways, this was the benefit is that yes, they met and maybe you're starting a process. But Putin, Trump, if you might remember, it said, we will come to some kind of agreement. We will have a ceasefire, and if not, if we don't get at least some degree of reciprocity from Putin from this summit, we're going to extract heavy measures, whether it be extreme sanctions or something beyond that.
Kind of an icebreaker.
You mentioned the sweatshirt, and Celeste and I were talking about this, about how fashion also says what's going on. Granted, a sweatshirt you may not call fashion, but what he's wearing, the CCP thing on there saying Soviet Union, you were talking about also with First Lady fashions too, and how they continue
very
to do this.
often. Yes. I mean, I actually think there was meaning behind the sweatshirt.
Oh,
everything
absolutely,
is down to the T, to the color, the member, even the person and the designer who makes for and oftentimes with fashion. But, it's one of those things where when we're looking at this, Ronan, you are, the part of a major global organization right here in Houston. You see these type of dynamics. What was there something that stood out to you specifically as somebody who works with European leaders continuously?
I suppose, like I say, in all honesty, obviously for the sake of the Ukrainian people and the Russian people, the vast majority of whom they might like Putin, they might have voted for him, but they're suffering incredibly. The Ukrainians, neither side releases data for understandable reasons, but the Ukrainian military losses are estimated to be 100, 120,000 killed already, probably another 200, 250,000 wounded, and at least probably 50 and 20,000 civilians killed. And you'll notice Putin kept the barrage of missiles attacking Ukrainian cities, did not stop. Even when the Europeans were arriving at the White House yesterday, it kept going. So I think, it's hopeful that there was some talk and some dialogue, but Putin has said absolutely nothing in regards to what he is willing to concede and come off of his main points. And I think that's the great difficulty of it.
We're speaking with Ronan O'Malley of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. If you'd like to join the conversation, give us a call, 713-440-8870. You can also text us at that number. If you look at this today and you looked at it last Wednesday, before either summit, did anything really change?
I think if there were changes, it's more of what happened back here back in the White House in D.C. When Zelenskyy this time, unlike when he met in February, had the support, kind of the needed support of having the Prime Minister of England, the President of France, the Chancellor of Germany, the Secretary General of NATO, all there to support him come together to work and discuss with Trump and his cabinet. And there, I suppose, maybe you've seen more movement or more flexibility that say, Putin has always said, absolutely, we will not have any sort of Western militarized force, even defensive force in Ukraine. That is why he started, one of the reasons he gives for starting the war in the first place. But you see some of the Europeans who do not like the idea of sending French troops on the ground in Ukraine, or German troops or British troops, but perhaps moving towards that more so. Trump himself he hasn't definitively said one way or the other, but for a long time he said we will never have American troops on the ground. But you might remember just yesterday when he was asked that question, he kind of
hesitated.
Hesitated. And is that for negotiating reasons, or is that he's realizing without that we're never going to get any agreement?
Let's move to the White House. We were on Fashion Watch with Zelenskyy. What would he wear? And it came out a black suit. No one really wore blue and gold, which would have been a nice gesture. So what do you make of what was being sent visually from the White House meeting?
Especially in regards to Zelenskyy's attire, I think one thing to preface it would be to make people realize what happened in February. That was not, he did not dress in kind of militaristic casual attire as an affront to Bush or to Trump or Obama or anyone he's met over the years since the full-scale invasion in 2022. He has not worn a suit. He has not worn kind of a traditional Western European style suit, not even for one meeting, whether it's been with Macron or with Starmer or with Mers, or say even with King Charles or even with the Pope. So that has been he is not like a dictator wearing a dossied up kind of uniform, with half a side full of medals here and there.
Right.
His attire are not official uniforms; they're just militaristic to show solidarity with the Russian soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers out there fighting and dying. And he just has said, this is a small way of me showing to the country that until this war is over, I am not going back to a peacetime mentality. So I think that's important to remember that the attire he wore in February to the White House is what he's wore all over the world, with meeting comparable leaders all over the world. What he wore on Monday was, I suppose, fancier, more dolled up. But if you see the outfits, I don't know exactly how to describe it. It was nicer looking or sharper looking, but it wasn't, again, say a full traditional suit. It wasn't with a typical tie. It was what he wore to Pope Francis's funeral. So I think he realized the optics that he had to change that. It was something he was able to kind of turn into a joke and turn back on the kind of reporter who had pestered him about it in February. He turned it back on him and said, "Hey, I'm the one looking better than you now." When they spoke
that
yesterday.
was funny.
Yes.
Now, for Europe's leaders that were gathering there at the White House during this meeting, it seems to be obviously there was a lot of optics, but there was also some substance there in regards to. Do you think this was a chance to undo any ground that Russia's President Putin may have gained over Trump or gained over essentially his positioning in Alaska? Do you think that they were able to accomplish what, from a substance standpoint, what they were trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think so, definitely, because that was kind of like you're referring to. That was their greatest concern, is coming for really Trump's first term, and in recent months and after Friday, we've heard what the Ukrainians would have to give up to get a peace deal, but we've never heard Putin once give up any real concession. And I think this was the idea of solidarity and the Europeans saying and showing to the United States, we're all here together. And I think more importantly, showing to Putin, like we realize the certainty of NATO and the European and American defensive alliance of the last 80 plus years may not be the same or exist from here on out, but the Europeans are starting to stand up. They're finally increasing their defense spending. They're finally getting more organized, but they're still far, far beyond the force that would be necessary to defend Ukraine in the same way the United States can, or even support a defense.
So earlier I asked you about the image of Putin and Trump shaking hands, how that played. How does that image of those 7 leaders and Zelenskyy standing with Trump in the White House, that image play, and what's that saying? We are all one? And then how does that play in with the Russian-U.S. negotiation?
Yeah, I think it was a godsend for Zelenskyy. He knew that he needed it. And I think there has to be a way of showing to Putin that what Zelenskyy and all Ukrainians are most concerned about is, even if we come to some form of agreement, even if the United States signs, it won't be something like NATO. It would not be that level of a definitive defense or commitment. But even if we're given some degrees of security commitment by the United States, 6 months from now, a year from now, will Trump change his mind and withdraw from that treaty or withdraw from that agreement the same way he did, say, with the Iranian nuclear agreement, when he said, we're withdrawing from this JCPO because it's a horrible agreement, but it also, don't worry, I'm going to renegotiate something better. And I think Ukrainians are worried about that.
So you're kind of a think tank. What do you think? Where is this going to go?
What do you think in your tank?
I suppose we're more of a platform. I don't know, we would call ourselves a think tank. But I suppose, where do I think it will go? I think we're still a long way off. I think there are a variety of reasons why Putin chose to invade Ukraine. The 2 biggest ones that I think he put forward to the Russian people to justify this, and now you have 250,000 Russians have been killed. You have almost 700,000 who've been wounded. So almost 1 million Russians have been wounded or killed. You've had a massive expense on that. The 2 of the biggest reasons he said why we have to do it, he said, Ukraine and NATO is going to invade and attack Russia, which was nonsense. Ukraine was a very long way off from ever joining NATO, if it was going to happen at all. NATO itself probably did not want to take on something as large as Ukraine, with a huge border along Russia, a lot of other different reasons, but basically said we have to watch out and be worried about NATO. That has completely backfired because of his invasion. NATO is now bigger and stronger. It is Sweden and Finland have joined. He has doubled the number of miles of border that Russia now has with NATO, with the inclusion of Finland. And the other kind of bit of madness was so if he said we had to have this war because they were going to attack us, it's a very difficult spot to go back to the Russian people, say, well, we will accept some form of an agreement where there are large numbers of European troops, of NATO troops, or even American troops stationed in Ukraine, which they were not in 2022 before the invasion. So that's kind of a difficult position to get out of. And secondly, just in terms of, if you remember the madness, despite the fact, obviously, that Zelenskyy is Jewish, Putin had for a long time leading up to the invasion said, these are neo-Nazis, we have to get rid of this neo-Nazi regime. But okay, well, if they're the worst regime ever, this is the worst regime that the Russians have dealt with since the Nazis, since Hitler. You're negotiating with them, and that exact same regime that you said you had to replace, that was the very beginning of the war. The attempt to get into Kyiv quickly was to displace and possibly kill Zelenskyy. That has not happened, and now he's saying we'll accept and we'll leave them there. So I think that's hard for the Russian people to accept.
So
Ronan O'Malley is the Chief Program Officer for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Ronan, thank you so much for joining us. Clearly, there's a lot more to cover. We will have to have you back on Hello Houston.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you.